So this is the fourth and final part in this 4-part series where I spent 25 years building up this zoo, all leading to having a 100-year zoo. I let it run for a year, by the way, so that I could see what my money situation would look like by the end of that time, and I was not disappointed. While it was slow, money was coming into my zoo, which made me very happy. Because I won't lie, for a minute there, I wasn't sure if I'd make it to the 100-year mark with how much money I was losing last episode. But now I don't have to worry about it, which means I'm ready to make the first habitat of this video, which is going to be for the springbok and the Thompson's gazelle. I made a path along the back of the timberwolf habitat and set up a barrier with some guest walk-through doors. And after working out how I wanted the guest path to look, I added the gazelles and the springbok. I took a moment to appreciate how creepy the staff looked, all gathered in front of the habitat, before changing the terrain to short grass and making them a shelter, with one-way glass, of course. I gave them bedding, toy and food enrichment, and a water source, after which I pulled out some trees to line the back wall of the habitat with. I added some common reeds around the water before throwing a variety of different bushes and flowers around the rest of the habitat. I kept most of the greenery to the back of the habitat, though, because I didn't want to block the guests' viewing area. But after that was done, I worked on the terrain. And this is going to sound a little ludicrous coming from me, but I didn't add too many rocks to this habitat because I didn't really think it was necessary. I put some in the water and a few scattered throughout the greenery, after which I reworked the barrier because I didn't like how it looked. And so I rounded it and was a lot happier with the look. I re-added the guest path and placed down the education speakers and donation bins, along with some benches, trash cans, and a few keep quiet signs, and this habitat was done. Which leads into the first in-between habitat building period of this video. I spent a chunk of time just hanging out with the Nile monitors before getting up to more useful activities. I realized that I never fixed the terrain in the hippo habitat, and I'm not really sure how I forgot to do that, but better late than never, I suppose. I also set up some keep quiet signs in the okapi habitat to keep their stress levels down. Other than that, though, nothing of real note happened. I will say, though, I remember why I initially put all the animals on contraceptives. Trying to keep up with the maturing babies before fights can break out is a hassle. And I kinda wish habitats had a population control option like the exhibits do, but they don't, and honestly, seeing all the babies running around again is worth having to break up the occasional fight. With all that done, though, it was time for the next habitat, which is one I've been eagerly awaiting. This habitat is going to house the 3 types of lemurs, those being the ring-tailed lemur, the red-ruffed lemur, and the black and white ruffed lemur. I started with setting up a wood barrier and connecting all the paths, after which I raised the barrier and changed the sidewalls to glass. Not for any functional reason, mind you, just for the aesthetic. And then I told the keepers to start bringing the lemurs to the habitat. After most of them had arrived, I pulled out the climbing structures so that I could shape the rest of the habitat around these. I also used one of the bigger climbing structures so that it could double as the shelter for these guys. Just to be extra, though, I did scatter around some of the smaller climbing pieces, before adding bedding underneath that along with the rest of their enrichment items. I gave them a water source and pulled out the greenery to start decorating. I started with the trees before adding some blue lotus plants to the water and scattering a few bushes around. These guys also like the giant rhubarb plant, and so I took the opportunity to add those. And then I got really distracted by how goofy the ring-tailed lemur looked while sitting. I mean, that just doesn't look comfortable. What a nasty little freak. I've never seen a creature look so stressed out while sitting. Goofy lemur aside, though, I worked on the terrain next before pulling out and adding the rocks to this habitat. After which I added education speakers, donation bins, benches, trash cans, and quiet signs, and this habitat was finished. I actually didn't wait the typical 2 to 3 years before jumping into the next habitat, mainly because I was really excited to add some red pandas to my zoo. I set up a half dome shape and made a null barrier around that before adding the red pandas in. And after the red pandas were in, I decided to change the barrier to wood with one-way glass at the front, which I then made climb-proof and gave them a water source. I gave them all their enrichment items before pulling out some trees to line the back of the habitat with, after which I added some Himalayan birch trees and added some various other greenery around, along with decorating the water. And after all the greenery was added, I placed some coolers down and made them a shelter. I fixed the terrain, added education speakers, donation bins, and added some rocks around, and this habitat was done. And with the red pandas finished, it was time for some in-between habitat building zoo stuff. There were actually a handful of things I got up to in this time. I started with replenishing the reptile house, after which one of the lemurs had a baby, which I thought was very cute. And then a true tragedy took place when one of Bert's babies passed away, from old age, I'd like to point out. So I set up the plaque on a bench outside the habitat. On a happier note, though, the red pandas had some babies, and I named one of them something I thought was rather fitting. And while I was over by the red pandas, I also set up a keeper hut and a staff building because neither of those things were anywhere close to this area, and I could see that eventually becoming an issue, so unlike most things, I got ahead of the issue before it could really start. After which it was time to make another habitat, which is going to be for the Himalayan brown bear. I started with making a path that veers off of the main path, and staking the terrain for what is going to be this habitat. Or for what I thought was going to be this habitat, at least. But when the barrier gave me one too many problems, I deleted it all and took a much simpler approach, and just made a rectangular habitat instead, with wood barriers around and glass for the viewing areas. Also, while I was setting up this habitat, I took a second to pick up some matured babies, and was pleasantly surprised to learn that I now had albino warthogs. But after that, I had the bears brought to the habitat and continued on. I made them a shelter similar to how I made the Timberwolf shelter, gave them a water source and added all the enrichment and bedding. I changed the terrain to all snow and added coolers. Then I was distracted by another Nile monitor passing away, leaving only one adult Nile monitor in the habitat, which meant I was going to have to put a new generation in there soon. But not now. For now, it was time to pull out the greenery and decorate the Himalayan brown bear habitat, keeping most of the coverage to the back, along with adding ivy patches along the barrier and on some of the climbing structures. And then it was rock time. And I decided to use these ice rocks, which really didn't look all that great if I'm being honest, and so I thought maybe adding snow rocks would help for some reason. It didn't, but I haven't used them before, and I wanted to, and so they stayed. I did mix in some normal tundra rocks, though, and it made it a little bit better. I played around with the rocks for quite some time before deeming them satisfactory, after which I added the education speakers and donation bins and messed around with the terrain just a little bit so that it wasn't all just snow, and this habitat was done. Before jumping into making the next habitat, I set up the final shopping area for this zoo, and while working on that, tragically, the last Nile monitor passed away. At least the last adult Nile monitor. There were still plenty of babies slinking around. I set up the memorial on a bench outside the habitat alongside the other two, and set my sights on restocking my Nile monitor supply. And I decided to add this boy to the habitat because he had hundreds across all categories, which is truly fitting for Bert's legacy. I had him brought to the habitat and named him Reuben, like after the sandwich, which I only know from the alien from Lilo and Stitch who lives rent-free in my head. But I technically didn't use the right spelling, but either way the name works. I also, for the first time of many, filled all 200 slots in my animal storage and had to clear it out. Also, I noticed that none of the guests were leaving this shop area, so I connected it to a second spot, which seemed to fix the issue. And then I was on to making the next habitat, which is going to be for both aardvarks and the Aldabra giant tortoise. I played around with the barrier quite a bit before getting whatever this shape is and deciding that it was good enough. I collected an albino aardvark and some tortoises I had sitting in my rewards tab, after which I had them brought to the habitat. I started with adding some animal burrows and a shelter to the habitat, after which I added the enrichment and gave them a water source. And with all that added, it was time to spruce up the habitat with some greenery. I threw around some trees before adding some blue lotus plants to the water, after which I changed the terrain to short grass, and continued on with adding various other plants and bushes, which to my absolute excitement also included one of my new favorite pieces of greenery, the giant rhubarb plant. And I finished off the greenery by sprinkling some leaf litter around the edge of bushes, after which it was time for rocks, which I was also very sparing with in this habitat, leaving most of the rock clusters around the edge. Except for the large rock clusters I used to incorporate the animal burrows better into the surrounding habitat, which I think came out looking rather neat. I added the education speakers and donation bins along with some benches and trash cans before finishing the habitat by fixing the terrain to both the tortoise and the aardvark's liking, which was kind of a delicate balance, but I eventually made it happen. But while I was busy finding balance between the aardvarks and tortoises, a lot of the camels had passed away, and while I was purchasing a new male, I saw this funky dude. And while I typically don't like buying the color variations, I figured the chance of me naturally getting this were pretty low, and I really wanted it. So I went ahead and bought him, and after seeing just how cool he looked, I had no regrets. But right after buying him, while I was collecting some matured babies, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that I now had albino springbok. Apparently both her parents had parents that were albino, and I just hadn't checked before this. But other than that, nothing too interesting happened in this in-between time. I just continued collecting maturing babies and replenishing habitats as need be. And it was now time to add another funky reptile to the zoo. And what I mean by that is that we're making a habitat for some Komodo dragons. starting with setting up a wood and glass round barrier and having them brought to the habitat. I made them a shelter with the front section open so that I didn't block any of the viewing area, after which I added bedding, enrichment items, and a water source to the habitat. I pulled out the greenery and started with decorating around the water before scattering a couple trees around, and placed a few bushes around the base of the trees before pulling out my second favorite plant, flowers. I love these flowers. They come in so many colors and are a great way to brighten up the greenery without adding big plants and taking up traversable area and impairing the visibility of the animals. The flowers were the last bit of greenery that I added before pulling out some rocks, which I kept mostly around the water with the exception of a rock or two placed in the greenery, after which I added the education speakers and donation bins, and this habitat was done. I wasn't really spending too much time in between habitat building at this point, by the way, because I wanted to leave enough time at the end to finish all the decorations. But possibly the cutest camel of all time was born in that short time, and I was just a little obsessed. I was going to change his name, but I actually thought it was rather charming, so I left it. Other than that, though, nothing too interesting happened. And now it's time for the next habitat, which is going to be for some spotted hyenas. This habitat came out probably one of the funnest shapes I made a habitat yet. And after the barrier was set up, I added a water source and had the hyenas brought to the habitat. I added the enrichment items, and then made them probably one of my most favorite shelters I've made so far, after which I gave them bedding and pulled out the trees, of which I only added 2, before decorating the water and adding other greenery in the form of bushes and my beloved flowers around the trees, and in various patches throughout the habitat. And then it was rock time. I started with adding rocks in and around the water before shifting gears a bit and reworking the terrain, after which I had to extend the habitat because I made it too small, and after all that was done, I added a few more clusters of rocks. I added education speakers and donation bins, and this habitat was done. In the brief time I spent in between this habitat and the last, I collected a leucistic ostrich. The hyenas had some really cute goblin children. Also, Vanessa the timber wolf died, and seeing as she was my favorite timber wolf, I set up a memorial on the barrier for her. I went to check on the aardvarks and tortoises, only to see that they had been overrun with tortoise babies. I didn't really have a solution for that though, so I just kind of left it in hopes that it would work itself out. And then probably one of the most exciting things ever happened. My grizzly bears had an albino baby, which was very exciting because I've had albino ostriches and warthogs before, but not an albino bear, so that was completely new for me. All the excitement aside though, it was time to make the last habitat of the zoo, which is going to be for the Nyala. I made a path along the back of the shop area, and set up a barrier using one-way glass and null barriers before having them brought to the habitat, after which I lined the back of the habitat with a ludicrous amount of trees. And it's not the first time I've done that. However, it is the first time I've done it and just used null barriers. Typically, I would make the barrier wood even if I was going to be covering it up, and you'll see how well that went for me in just a little bit. For now, though, I gave them a water source and made them a shelter. I added the bedding and gave them their enrichment items, before pulling out the greenery once again and decorating the water, after which I placed a few trees around, and then it was rock time. And seeing as I had been sparse with the rocks in most of the other habitats, I took the opportunity to add as many as I could in this habitat. The rocks were still mostly focused around the front of the habitat and around the water, but I was still pleasantly happy with the amount I was able to add. I worked on the terrain, after which I added the education speakers and donation bins, and this habitat was finished. And while I was watching the rest of the Nyala being brought to the habitat, this happened. Yeah, my belief that if I just added enough trees, they wouldn't be able to escape was very wrong. So I changed the null barrier to wood while I waited for one of the vets to capture her. And after she was brought back to the habitat, she looked rather smug about making me feel like an idiot. However, smug Nyala aside, now that all the habitats had been added, it was time for decorations. I started with adding benches and bins along the paths that didn't have any yet, after which I started decorating the outside of the zoo along the back of the red deer habitat with trees. I didn't decorate the new section, however, because I still needed to add walls to all the staff buildings and shops, and so I got to work on that, using the same wall/ceiling combo that I used for the first part of the zoo. I also remembered to decorate the exhibits, and after a not-so-short amount of time, all the buildings were covered. Also, we got some Reuben babies, which probably isn't the first batch that had been born, but it was the first one that I saw the notification for, and I'm pretty sure the whole clutch was albino, which doesn't really mean anything, I just thought it was neat. I took to filling out the empty spaces in and around the zoo with trees, and pleasantly enough, I was able to let the game run as I did this. which definitely slowed down the process, having to stop and collect matured babies. But after 2 years, I finished adding all the trees, and I was ready to add decorations to all the habitats. I started with adding these rainbow hyenas along the Hyena habitat barrier. I added decorations around the Himalayan brown bear habitat, in the front of the timberwolf habitat, and I added a couple lemur walking signs both outside and in the lemur habitat. Gave the red pandas some statues. I gave the hippos this really judgmental looking hippo face. The Indian elephants and the gharial also got statues. I added panda posters and statues to the shopping area their habitat sits by, after which I finished off my decorating with the red deer. And now that all the decorations were in place, I could get to the part of this video that I had been eagerly awaiting, which is going to maybe sound a bit boring to you, but I wanted to record B-roll of all the habitats. Why, you might ask? Well, because I genuinely haven't looked at some of these habitats, other than short visits to collect babies and whatnot, since I made them, and I was thoroughly excited to revisit all of them. And that is exactly what I did. I also took the time to take the recordings in the order that I added them to the zoo, so enjoy the next couple of minutes of what were my favorite parts of that recording. I would like to say, though, it took way longer than I thought it would. I figured it would only take maybe 5 years to record all of them, but by year 100 I still had like 4 habitats to go. And I think what made it take so long was that in between getting clips, I was collecting babies and managing the zoo, but also sometimes I would wait for the keepers to come through and clean the habitat so it would be nice and neat before recording. Either way, though, year 100 came and passed over to year 101, and this 100-year zoo was done. Before I leave though, I will share my own little trick as to how I keep my animal storage empty every time I start a new zoo. And the answer isn't selling them. What I do is I have them all put into quarantine. Because if they're in quarantine, they're taken out of my animal storage. And to be honest, I'm only mentioning it because I'm kind of hoping someone has a better way of handling their animal storage in between zoos, and that they will share with me that information. But that'll be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did enjoy watching, maybe consider subscribing. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.